All right, I'm going to start this application. Take a look at it. Okay, so we're going to do a pretty simple example. So we have this HTML. I'm not going to use CSS. Sorry to disappoint you. So we have HTML, which just has a form, basically. So you have a form, and then you can click search, and it will make a request to a third-party API, which in our case will be this one. So posts. Let's do posts. Yeah. So we'll make a request to this free kind of very great service, which is very useful for practicing. So we'll make a request here, but we're gonna add a query string. So posts like user ID equals no. So here we're adding this query string. So instead of getting all posts, we're getting posts based on the user ID. And this is a fairly simple API, but depending on how it's set up, you can have much more complex query strings. But we'll stick with this. So our goal is the user goes to our site, enters a user ID, some number, presses search, and then gets displayed all of the posts belonging to that user. Okay. So here's our this is basically all the HTML we have for now. Let me add div, and this will be, I'll give it an ID. So this will be where we end up displaying all of our posts. Okay, so in our app.js, so we have to do a few things. One, we have to be able to get user input. So if the user enters 5, we need to be able to grab that. So let's start with that. So what do we have to do in order to get user input?
The listening thing first.
Yes, in EventListener.
Event.
So I will, would you guys prefer if I make this a class or just do some functions?
Whatever way you determine more proper.
Probably more proper to make a class, but I don't want that to be distracting.
Do a class. I vote for class.
Class. Okay. New keyword. So now we have this posts. So we can have let's have a constructor. And maybe in this case, we'll pass in the URL. We can make this reusable. So great. So we have this URL. And then okay. So we decided we want to add an event listener here. So let's just write a function that does that. So so we'll have a method. Again, we don't need the function keyword here. This is a method in the class. So first we will need to grab this form, right? So look at the HTML. We have this form. So let's grab that. And the form, I think we gave it an ID. Yeah, my form. Okay. So hashtag my form. All right. So now we have this form. So let's just try console logging. And I'm going to add just a runner. All right, let's see if this works. So it loaded and I get the form, so I can see that form there. All right, so far so good. So now we have a form, we have to add an event listener. So how do I add an event listener to the form?
What did you say, Chad?
So we need to add an event listener to the form. So we have the form, but we need to listen for an event.
That was something with you could look for the change in one of the values or the parameters.
Yeah, so we can decide on what event we want to listen for, but how do we add?
Is it just form.add event listener?
Yeah. So form.add event listener, and this takes two parameters. One is the event. In this case, we're actually gonna listen for the submit event. We have a form. We're gonna listen to that event. We could do this differently, but the submit event is kind of typical. So then we have a callback function. It'll take the event. And then once we have the event, we can let's try console. So something happens here. A couple of things happen. One is, looks like everything reset, but I can see that this got added. Does anyone know what happened, or take a guess? Let me try it one more time. If you look right here, you can see that whatever we're logging shows up for just a split second. So console logging E, and then it goes away. So the page is actually refreshing. Why is it refreshing? Well, because that's the default behavior.
Chad, you want mute
Did I? Okay.
back now though? Did you say, you were saying that it's because the page refreshed and then you cut out?
Oh, sorry about that. Can you guys hear me now? Let
Yeah.
me put on.
I think you said that because it's a default. It's not set, or that is the default.
Sorry, can you guys hear me now? Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, so there's some default behavior here which we can actually override. So there's something we can do, e.prevent default. It actually doesn't really matter the order you do that, but we'll do. So we're going to prevent the default occurrence, which is a refresh. So it basically tries to send the information back to the same page. That's why you get the query parameters. So now when we prevent the default, that doesn't happen. So we don't get that. We submit. So you can see that we have the event printing here. Okay, so we have this form. But we don't want to just get the event. We want to get whatever the user put in there. So I'm just going to skip a couple steps. Sometimes it's a pain in the ass to find these things, but e.target.elements. User.value. And the reason it's user is because we named it user here. So unfortunately, it's a little verbose, but might have to play around with things. But that way you get it. Okay, so now we can actually grab the user input here. So someone tell me what we are trying to do. Give me a recap.
Is the ultimate goal trying to get the JSON information?
Yeah, I mean, so I would say, yeah, that's kind of like the second to last goal. So the ultimate goal would be to display all of user 4445's posts on this page. But in order to do that, we are going to have to get some JSON.
Do we want to capture the user ID value that's put in, and then we want to combine that with our base URL to do the GET request to get the JSON?
Yeah, so we're going to need to follow a format similar to this. So we have this, we add an event listener. And once this event gets triggered, we're going to need to make a request. So let's write another function. User API. That's going to take an ID. So I'm going to call that function up here. And this function is actually going to make that request. So the response will be fetch. And we'll do this dot URL. Maybe we can just make this a formatted string. So this dot URL, and then there will be a question mark, and then Post user ID. And we'll do ID. So here's again, we're just making a GET request. We're not making a post. It's a little more complicated for making a post request, but this is just a GET request, so it's fairly simple. So what is res going to be now?
Whatever where do we pass through the URL for the constructor? Or where does that come from? Is that entered when okay. So this line 29, what's
This is
not calling into
URL.
URL.
Yeah. So when we create a new instance of posts, we give it a URL. So now every instance has this URL.
Part of the URL as URL. And then in 17, it combines that beginning that we gave it with the ID that we get from the form. And it will put those two into one big URL and fetch it from, and fetch the information, the JSON from that URL.
Yes. So what is res? So what does fetch return?
Is that going to be the ID? With that, is that code going to get is that for the ID, to get the ID? This URL? I don't know, is it?
That'll return the whole chunk of JSON data, right?
As a
Because it's
promise.
going to that URL, including the ID. and
Yes.
getting
So,
all the entries with that ID.
so you would intuitively, you would want it to return the JSON data, but what it actually returns is, as Patrick said, it returns a promise.
That's right. And
So
then you have
you,
something.
yeah.
With that
So,
second thing.
so yeah. So let's first off, so we're gonna have to do a couple things, but we'll fix this in a second. So we can see that we have a promise. So what if we try to do something like we have to convert it JSON.
Yeah.
So what is going to happen here? Let's see. Uh-oh.
When you say it returns the promise, what exactly is the promise?
Well, a promise is a JavaScript object.
Okay,
It's a promise is a class, and it's
is it?
basically
okay,
it's basically the way that JavaScript handles asynchronous programming now. So
okay. Is it equal to a value? When you say returns the promise, is there a value associated with it?
well, I mean, it contains a promise. You think of, an instance of a promise contains a whole bunch of information,
Okay,
but you can't just access it directly. There's a
Okay.
particular way that you have to interact with a promise. So this isn't going to work because this returns a promise. But again, if you think of how JavaScript executes, this is a promise. It's immediately going to go to the next line. So this is basically not ready yet. So we have to do,
Async.
yeah. So we can use the async.
And then await.
Yeah. So the async await is syntactic sugar. It's convenience syntax. that ultimately is going to be a promise. So when we say this user API function is async, we basically mean it's going to return a promise.
Mm. But we don't want the promise. We want what's inside there. So that's why.
Yes,
we
but you can't just, it's in there, but we can't get it. Bad thing. So you have to do some poking and prodding to actually get what we want. So we've added this async await. So let's take a look at what the response.json is now. Okay, let's see what that is.
What's our base URL again? Are we
Typical.
missing the post
Thank you.
endpoint?
Mhm. So let's leave that. So let's try it again. So we have a problem. So one thing we should always make sure to do is handle errors. So try with async await, you wrap things in a try catch block. And you can grab the error and just so let's try this again. So now our application isn't broken, but we can handle the error however we need to. Okay. So let's fix this now. We'll try it again. So now we're getting back.
And you could put posts in the main URL if you only wanted to get the posts back, but by putting it into the like the add-on section, we can access anything in there, not just posts.
Yeah, so the query string that we're adding here is, again, this is just how this API, I mean, this is a common standard, but what's happening is that we're making a request to a server. A server is getting this as, you know, part of our request. And the way the server is set up is it's just going to like parse this. It's a string. We're sending it a string. It's just going to parse it. It could do whatever the hell it wants ultimately. So you could just say, you know, you could just return a random post every time if you're controlling the server and you're writing code. Obviously, you wouldn't do that, but so my point is that this is a convention. It's not. There's nothing necessary about this. So this kind of convention where you have a query string, question mark, and then like a key value. So the server is going to get this string. It's going to say, okay, I know what to do with this string. I know that this person is looking for a user ID. So once that string is parsed, it's going to say, okay, I'm going to talk to my database now. So the server, the client, like you on your web browser, has sent a request to the server. The server then says, okay, I'm going to parse that request, and then I'm going to make a request to my database backend. So that request is going to get ultimately turned into a SQL query. That query is going to get executed on the database. The database is going to send that response back to the server. The server is going to process that response, serialize it, turn it into JSON, and then send the JSON back to the original client.
Inside of my fetch.
How's that?
Inside of it's going to come back to that fetch.
Yes. Yeah. So the promise, this fetch, you know, this result is going to be a promise, and that promise is going to contain It's going to contain
All
that value.
that happens within that part of that line that you have highlighted now.
Yes.
That's kind of cool.
And then there's just one other step you have to do because of the way the fetch API works, which is basically making sure that all of the body has come in, so that the entire response has come in. And once you do that, then you can use it just like anything else. So here we have the JSON, which we can examine here. So it looks like we have 9 or 10 items. And each one of these is an object with properties. So let's just say we want to display, we only want to display the titles.
What is the first line of that return with the 10 and then all the ellipses in
Yeah, I mean, this is just,
10 things that came back?
Yeah. I mean, this is just the way that Chrome DevTools displays this.
A very bad attempt at describing what you've got.
Yeah, so it tells you that you have 10 things and it's an array of objects.
I guess that's,
So-
yeah.
Okay, so we have the basic data that we need.
Now I gotta get those titles.
Yeah.
So this is the process we would, these are the steps we would follow each time. So when you showed us the JSON, it had like user ID. What if the user ID, when you showed us that JSON, did it have like more than one user ID?
So when we make, if you make a request just to get all posts, then it's got
more than one user ID. How would that work?
Yeah. So here we're in this case we're asking this is a dummy API, but here we're asking for all the posts that are in the database. That's basically what we're asking for. But our application doesn't want all the posts. We just want for particular users. So we only want posts for user 5. So that's all we're getting.
So when we get it back, it's already filtered.
Yeah. What if we want user 5 and 6 and 7? How would that work?
So it would depend on how the server chooses to process things.
Okay.
That would be in the API documentation.
Yeah, in our case, this is a very simple implementation. So something complicated like that, you're not going to be able to do directly. You could probably do but it just depends on how this is implemented. So APIs, I mean, you'll be building APIs for your application, and there are standards and best practices, but you can do whatever you want. So you'll see in the real world, even though there's kind of a well-known standard, you'll see all kinds of little variations. So it's just like using a third-party library. You have to read the documentation because there's going to be specific.
Which one?
Okay, so now we have this. We have all the data we need.
Do we need to return res JSON out of user API?
So it depends on how we want to structure our code. So the way we have it right now, we've got this event listener. When this event gets triggered, this function runs, And then we have this value, but what do we do with it now? Where do you go from here? So we have a couple options. One, we could, maybe call another function from inside here, which could work, but then, now we have very tightly coupled application. So, a slightly better option might be to have like a wrapper function. So rather than doing this directly, we'll call, let's see, let's call it handle event. So handle event, and this will be ID, and then I'm going to call user API. So let's okay, but so let me return.
And so async and await would take the place of then, right? We don't need to do then.
Yeah. So it's kind of an either or. So you can either chain like then statements, or you can use this convenient syntax.
So does async and await, does it have a the fail, I can't remember what it was called, the alternative to then?
So yeah, so if you use the async await, you have to use a try catch block for errors.
The reject is not there. Reject and catch is not there.
Right. Oh, okay. I see what you're saying. So yeah, right. So we don't have direct access to the promise itself here. The fetch is kind of a wrapper around a promise.
Okay.
So we could do other, again, if this were a real application, we would want to do more robust checks rather than just, so we could check, let's just do res.headers. Let me fix this and handle event. And I guess I'll spoil the surprise. We need to make this async as well. We make this async because this returns a promise, basically, because this is an async function. So we're stuck in promise land forever now.
Can you combine async and await with your promise resolve then whole?
Yeah, so you could do that. You could return another promise. We could have an async function where we just return a promise. You can do that. So let's do this real quick. Let's see what the headers are. Well, let's do headers dot keys. Yeah. Headers dot values entries. Let's try that. Headers dot entries. Function. Oh, God. So anyway, so I have to look it up, but yeah, you can get information about the header. So for example, the status code, is the status code 200 or 201 or is it 400? And you could do different things depending on what. So you don't just have to say make the request and then process it and so on. You could have more fine-grained control. But we're not gonna worry about that right now. So now we have this handle event. So we get all of the user posts now. So once we have all of the posts, I think we're gonna wanna just get the titles, right? So let well, so we have a couple things we could do. We could grab the posts initially. Yeah, let's just do that. We'll use map. Title. I think let's try that and then we'll print or all right, see what we get. Looks like we get a whole bunch of titles. All right, once we have that, then we're going to want to generate a bunch of
HTML.
Yeah, so we can call to this dot generate. We'll write that right here and generate HTML titles. And we can first find out where we want to put this. So in this case, posts. So I don't know. We'll document that. Query selector. And then we can loop through everything in the title. It's just an array. So for all right, so we loop through all the titles, and then what we're going to do is we'll create an element. So we'll just create p tags paragraphs. So that p equals document dot create element. Give it a p tag, and then p dot. We talked about this yesterday. Remember text content or inner text? Let's use text content equals titles I, and then we'll attach it. So post dot pen child p. So let's see if this works.
Wow.
And if we do a different ID, we should get different nonsense. So not Olum. Oh, it's going to get appended. So let me refresh. That's different. So the basics of this is you're gonna do often, although you're not going to be, at least in this program, you're not really going to be doing vanilla JavaScript like this. You'll be using React. So there'll be a layer of abstraction, but ultimately, this is what's happening.
Is it accurate to think of the DOM or the document as like an object that has the parameters?
Yeah, so the DOM is basically like a tree structure.
Okay.
So you can think of, let me find an image. Yeah, something like this. So we have, we have like the whole document. So we have the actual HTML, but then this gets kind of represented. So there's an abstract representation of this, which is the DOM, the document object model, which is basically like a tree with a bunch of nodes. So as tree, and then there's like the root node, HTML, then you have a head and body, right? And then within the body, you can have an element, and you don't have to worry about these like attribute nodes. So you have like an element, like an A tag element, and an H1 element. And in practice, these also have like text nodes and attribute nodes, but don't have to worry about that. But yeah, so you can have an element that has like a div, and then that div can also have child nodes. So you get the structure, and it's like a tree structure.
Is that stored in memory? Like as part of the browsers?
Yeah, the browser handles that.
Okay.
Simpler one. Yeah.
So some of the APIs charge like per access or per query.
Yeah.
Then I would imagine you have to balance that out with how much memory you're using. Like you could theoretically query the whole data set of all of those posts from all the IDs with one query, and then just hold that in memory and let the user find what they need in there. Or you could, like we did, put the filter essentially on the URL when we're querying it, and then just have that smaller data set.
Yeah, so that's a good point. So I would try to use free APIs on this program, unless you have a really specific need, then you're welcome to, but you don't have to pay for API access or anything.
Or just theoretically, those would be the trade-off between who's doing what and who's accessing what and where it's coming from.
Right. So it depends. There are a few factors that might make you lean one way or another. So one would be, let's say, frequency of updates. So if you're doing something like the weather, so you could make, so I visit, the weather page or whatever, and when I go there, when I initially load the page, it makes a request. It fetches some API, or fetches some data from an API, then displays it. So it says, it's 80 degrees outside. But then, so I could preserve that data, but then it's kind of like it's going to get stale pretty quick, so it's not really very useful. So that's one issue, is like how quickly does that data get stale? The other issue is how much data. So you could imagine that if I go to Amazon.com
Download everything.
and as soon as I go there, like every single product that they have, it gets sent to me in a giant JSON. I mean, it's going to take, I don't know how long that would take. So that won't work. So depending on what you're doing, so Amazon is kind of stuck with every time I look for something, I have to make a request to their backend.
Mhm.
And also, I mean, there's also a problem with stale data too, because if they're out of stock of something, they probably want to let me know.
Before you buy it.
Yeah. So I would, yeah, these are good things to think about, but in general, I would say that in terms of how you design your application, you're going to want to make a request. You're basically going to want to make a new request for every time.
Mhm.
If you have like hard-coded data that's part of your application, you can also store that in like a JSON object in your. So if there's certain hard-coded information that isn't going to change. So for example, if you're, so for our group project, what we did was we made a mobile app that that worked with the Chicago CTA, so the
Mhm.
red line. So if you're on a train, it tells you like you're at one stop and you want to get off at another stop. So anyway, but the point is that there's that the information about train stations is pretty stable. Like, yeah, it's true that they could build a new station or, you know, remove a station, but that's not something that's going to happen on like a daily or weekly or even maybe yearly basis, something like that. But if that happens, then you can implement. So rather than requesting that data every single time, we just encoded that, like the coordinates for all of the train stations, just in a JSON file in the app itself. So there are cases where you can like hard code some data, but things like, you know, updates for service, you're going to want to request that live.
And you're just being aware not to put it in the other extreme where you'd be doing like a request for each, like you mentioned, like in a for loop or something like that. Just make sure that you're getting the chunk of data that you need all at once.
Yeah, so you don't want to make it. So for the purposes of this course, I would say try to find something that's free, and probably you're not going to be making like 10,000. If you're making 10,000 requests a day, then you're doing something wrong. If you find that that's happening, maybe someone stole your API key, or maybe you've got stuck in a loop somewhere.
Yeah. Okay.
So are there any questions about how the fetch API works? Or promises in general, maybe?
It's just a matter of trying it out a few times now. This was helpful though.
Yeah, so as long as you're doing like a side effect, then promises are fairly, you just have to remember that once you initiate a promise, you have to stay within that promise. You can't just jump out of it and start using that value somewhere else.
Mm-hmm.
Thanks for the class. Just have to look at the video and practice and do some code along.
Yeah. So I'll stop recording.